No one who stepped inside the Tolland estate ever lasted more than 7 days. The stories began in whispers, traded in dimly lit taverns and passed down through generations like a family curse. Some spoke of a terrible presence that lingered in the halls. Others mentioned screams echoing through the walls, clocks that stopped ticking, or shadows that moved without light. But one thing remained consistent. No soul who dared to live there ever survived a full week. And now, after nearly a decade of silence, someone new had arrived. Before we dive into this chilling tale, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next unbelievable story. Now let's begin. The year was 1924. The setting: the dense forests of rural Massachusetts, just outside the sleepy village of Drowsbury. Hidden behind a long-forgotten road, shrouded by towering trees and a permanent veil of fog, stood the Tolland estate, a towering Victorian mansion built in 1856. Its windows were black as coal, and the iron gate creaked like a dying breath when disturbed. The air smelled of damp earth and forgotten things. Dr. Jonathan Keene had never believed in ghost stories. A Harvard professor of folklore and mythology, his life was dedicated to dissecting the roots of superstition, unmasking the irrational, and confronting fear with cold, academic precision. So when news reached him that he had inherited a distant relative's estate in the woods, an uncle he had never met, his interest was piqued, not by the inheritance itself, but by the tale that surrounded it. The train ride from Boston was long and quiet. The farther he traveled, the more the world seemed to retreat into silence. Upon arriving in Drowsbury, a local driver offered him a ride to the estate but refused to approach the gate. Keene walked the final stretch alone, suitcase in hand, boots crunching over gravel, as the towering mansion emerged from the mist like a relic of some decaying dream. The house was larger than he imagined. 3 stories high, flanked by 2 stone towers and covered in ivy that twisted like veins around the wood and brick. The front door groaned under its own weight as he pushed it open, revealing a vast foyer lined with portraits that watched him with lifeless eyes. Dust clung to every surface, and the scent of rotten paper lingered like a memory. Keene took cautious steps through the main corridor, his footsteps muffled by thick, moth-eaten rugs. The furniture was untouched, frozen in time. Claw-footed sofas, a cracked mirror above the fireplace, books stacked in chaotic towers. A grand staircase spiraled upward, its railing adorned with carvings of angels and beasts intertwined. On a small table near the stairs, he found a tarnished keyring and a leather-bound journal. The initials E.T. were pressed into the cover. Curious, Keene opened to the first page, only to find it blank. As he flipped through, faint impressions became visible, writing once erased or faded by time. That evening, as rain began to patter against the window panes, Keene unpacked his things in the old master bedroom. The bed was stiff but intact. A fireplace sat dormant in the corner, and next to it, an old grandfather clock stood as tall as a man. It ticked steadily, each second echoing with mechanical certainty. Keene sat at the desk to write his first entry in his own journal, an academic account of his experience meant for study and publication. He lit a candle and scribbled down his initial thoughts, dismissing the unease in his stomach as a symptom of isolation. Outside, the wind howled like a warning. But Dr. Keene didn't believe in warnings. Not yet, Doctor. Jonathan Keene rose early the next morning, the pale light of dawn filtering through the cracked window panes. The house was unnervingly still. No creaks of old wood settling, no birdsong beyond the glass, just silence so deep it pressed against his ears. He poured himself a cup of water from the jug left in the kitchen, brushing off a layer of dust that had settled overnight. The quiet was almost soothing. He spent the day cataloguing the rooms. There were at least 15, a library filled with decaying books, a dining room with a long table that could seat 20, and a study with cabinets of yellowed documents. Every door opened with resistance, and every room carried a heavy air of abandonment. Yet it all felt curated, as if someone had left in a hurry but intended to return. Most curious were the markings on the floor beneath the carpets, faint, circular patterns drawn in what looked like chalk or ash. He made a note of them in his journal. In the late afternoon, he returned to the library. Dust motes floated in the air like ghosts in sunlight. As he ran his fingers along the bookshelves, he found several tomes with pages torn out and margins filled with illegible notes. One, in particular, stood out: The Arcane Rituals of New England. Inside, there were sketches of symbols matching those on the floor. He lingered over the pages, but refused to let superstition cloud his objectivity. By evening, the sky had darkened prematurely. The house seemed to retreat into itself. Thunder rolled in the distance. Keen lit a few candles and settled in the study to read. The quiet, so comforting in the morning, now felt oppressive. Every tick of the grandfather clock echoed louder than it should have. The flames flickered strangely, their shadows dancing along the walls in disjointed patterns. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the clock stopped ticking. Keen glanced up from his notebook. The silence hit him with such suddenness that he felt it in his chest. The ticking had become a part of the house's rhythm, and without it, the space felt dead. He stood, candle in hand, and approached the clock. The pendulum was frozen mid-swing. He reached out to touch it, and just as his fingers neared the brass, a distant sound stopped him cold. A woman was crying upstairs. It was soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakably human. The hairs on his neck stood on end. He turned toward the staircase, heart pounding. His rational mind fought for control. Old houses creak, he reminded himself. Wind howls. Pipes groan. Sounds twist in strange ways when walls are thick and time has settled. But this was not wind. This was weeping. He climbed the stairs slowly, candle trembling in his grip. With each step, the sobbing grew louder, measured, mournful, as though someone mourned their own fate. When he reached the landing, the sound seemed to move as if retreating down the hallway. He followed it past closed doors and dusty picture frames until it vanished just outside the attic door. The crying stopped. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door. It was locked with a heavy chain. Cold sweat ran down his back. Keen did not believe in ghosts. But for the first time in years, he began to feel the weight of his solitude. The estate wasn't just abandoned, it was aware. Back in his bedroom, he scribbled in his journal by candlelight, his handwriting shaky but determined. He wrote down every sound, every pattern, every second the clock had stopped. He would explain it. He had to. There was always an answer. There had to be. And yet somewhere beyond the bedroom wall something was still watching. The following morning arrived shrouded in fog, heavier than before. Light barely filtered through the grey veil outside, casting the estate in a permanent state of twilight. Keen had slept poorly, haunted by the sound of that distant weeping and the image of the locked attic door. His logical mind clung to reason, but something had shifted. The house no longer felt simply old, it felt inhabited. Determined to maintain objectivity, Keen made his way to the village library. He hoped local records or newspapers might contain references to previous owners of the estate, accounts that could shed light on what he had heard. Drowsbury's streets were deserted, save for a few wary glances from behind curtains. The locals did not welcome visitors, and they certainly did not speak of the Tolland estate. Inside the library, the smell of aged parchment and damp wood filled the air. An elderly librarian, Miss Wren, peered at him from behind thick spectacles. When he introduced himself and mentioned the estate, her expression faltered. "Tolland?" she said softly, as though uttering the name might summon something. "Best leave that place alone, sir. Nothing good's ever come from that house." "I'm not here for folklore," Keen replied. "I'm researching. Historical context, legal records, anything you might have." She hesitated, then slowly rose and beckoned him to follow. In a back corner, behind stacks of dusty town registries, she produced a slim folder labelled with trembling script, Tolland, Elias, 1857. Keen took the file with care. Inside were newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a yellowed photograph of a man with hollow eyes. Elias Tolland, builder and first owner of the estate, was once a prominent figure in Drowsbury, a man of means and intellect. But in 1857 something happened. According to a brittle newspaper clipping, Elias had hosted a series of séances in the house. He was fascinated by spiritualism, a growing trend at the time, and claimed he had made contact with a presence beyond the veil. Days after his final séance, he vanished. The estate changed hands multiple times over the following decades, often sold at a loss. Most owners abandoned it within days. A few were never seen again. One handwritten note penned by an unnamed source read, "The house remembers, it keeps them. 7 nights, no more." Keane closed the folder slowly, heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to dismiss it all. Fantasy, exaggeration, coincidence, but the facts piled up like bricks forming a wall. He had already experienced more in 2 nights than any rational explanation could account for. Miss Wren watched him closely. "Do you believe it?" he asked her. She shook her head, but her voice wavered. "It doesn't matter what I believe. That house. It doesn't let go. It tests you, it finds your fears. And when the 7th night comes—" She didn't finish. Back at the estate, the air felt colder than before. Keane stood on the front steps for a moment, folder in hand, staring up at the looming facade. The windows, still black, seemed to gaze back. He was beginning to understand why people left. That evening, he wrote in his journal with more urgency. He transcribed every note from the folder, every date and detail. He referenced Elias Tolland and his obsession with contacting the dead. He jotted down a phrase that echoed in his mind, though he wasn't sure where he'd heard it. It only takes one answer to believe. But belief was not his goal. He was here to study, to understand. Superstition could be dissected like a specimen. He had to remain grounded, no matter how persuasive the darkness became. Still, as he closed his notebook for the night, the silence pressed in once more, and the house waited. Night fell fast over the Tolland estate, as though darkness had been waiting just beyond the trees. By the time Keane lit the fireplace in the study, a heavy gloom had settled over the house. The air felt denser, colder, as if the walls themselves were exhaling frost. He tried to immerse himself in reading, surrounding himself with the comfort of logic, but the words on the page seemed to blur, to shift between lines. Fatigue tugged at his focus, but he refused to give in. It began again around midnight. The house creaked more than usual, with noises that seemed deliberate, too slow to be natural, too distinct to be forgotten. Footsteps echoed from the upper floor, soft but rhythmic, pacing from one end of the corridor to the other. He stopped reading, held his breath. The pacing stopped with him. He stood up, candle in hand, and moved toward the staircase. As he climbed, each step protested beneath his weight. The corridor was empty. Dust shimmered in the flickering light, but nothing stirred. Still he felt it, a presence nearby, watching from just beyond the reach of his senses. Then he saw her. Down the hallway, just past the narrow window overlooking the east garden, stood the figure of a girl in white. Pale, unmoving, face obscured by shadow. She didn't advance, she didn't speak. She simply watched. Keane blinked. She was gone. His heart thundered in his chest. He rushed to the window, looked both ways. Empty halls, silence, no sign of movement. He returned to the study, more agitated than afraid, convincing himself it had been a trick of the light, a side effect of exhaustion. But the whispers began soon after. At first they came from behind the walls, soft, unintelligible murmurs like 2 voices conversing in the next room. As he pressed his ear to the plaster, they ceased. He sat back down. The moment he resumed writing, they returned, louder, clearer. This time they said his name. "Jonathan." He froze. "Jonathan. Help us." He stood again, every muscle taut, searching the corners of the room. The fire hissed behind him. Shadows swayed in strange directions. He moved through the rooms, calling out, trying to trace the source, but the voice danced from wall to wall, elusive and cruel. In the hallway mirror, he caught a glimpse of himself, and then something else. A shape stood just behind his shoulder. When he turned, there was nothing. But when he looked back into the glass, the shape had moved closer. He covered the mirror with a sheet. By the time he returned to the bedroom, dawn was still hours away. His journal lay open on the desk, and he wrote furiously, documenting everything. The hallucination of the girl, the whispers, the mirror. But even as he wrote, his hand trembled. His breathing was shallow, and his mind, it no longer felt like his own. What if the stories were true? He dismissed the thought immediately. Sleep deprivation could explain the visual distortions. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon in isolation, but these explanations didn't sit comfortably anymore. Something in the house was responding to him, watching, manipulating. He lay down without undressing, eyes locked on the ceiling. He couldn't sleep, not with the image of that girl burned into his mind. The way she stood still, not like a living thing, but like something placed, positioned. As the hours dragged on, the whispers subsided, but the silence felt heavier than sound. He thought of Miss Wren's warning, of the folder, of Elias Tolland. And then, somewhere deep in the belly of the estate, a door creaked open. Just one. No footsteps followed. Only the echo, lingering far too long. By the third day, Keane no longer tried to convince himself that the house was empty. The creaks had voices, the shadows had weight, the silences breathed, and now something had opened a door in the night. He just didn't know which. He spent the morning walking the halls, testing knobs, gently pushing on panels and pressing his ear to the walls. Every floorboard, every sconce, every uneven edge became suspect. There had to be a pattern, some architectural detail he'd overlooked. The estate was vast and old, and houses built in that era often held secrets. He was determined to find them. In the second-floor library, while scanning the shelves, he noticed a small draft of air that didn't belong. One of the tall bookcases near the eastern wall seemed slightly offset. He pulled a few books from the shelf, knocked along the backboard, and listened. Hollow. He ran his hands along the edge until his fingers found a groove, a seam where no seam should be. Applying pressure, he heard a faint click. The bookshelf shuddered and groaned inward, revealing a narrow descending staircase, steep and swallowed in blackness. Keane lit a lantern. The flame flickered violently as he stepped inside, the air dry and stale like something long entombed. The steps were stone, worn at the center from long-forgotten use. He descended slowly, each footfall echoing deeper than the one before, until the staircase opened into a small, hidden room beneath the estate. The chamber was circular and tight, no larger than a study. The walls were stone, covered in markings he didn't recognize, symbols drawn in soot overlapping each other like layers of noise. In the center stood a wooden table stained with time and something darker. Atop it lay a rusted dagger, an extinguished candle, and a book with no title. Keane's breath quickened. He flipped the book open. The pages were brittle, the script jagged and dense, written in Latin and something more arcane. Symbols matched those on the walls. He turned page after page until he stopped at one particular phrase, repeated in red ink across 2 full pages. Welcome her in silence, speak her name in blood. Beside the altar, the floor bore a design carved directly into the stone, a large circle with intricate patterns radiating outward like a sun. Dried material filled the grooves, brown and cracked with age. He traced the lines with his lantern. At the center, one word was scratched so deeply into the rock that it gouged the surface. Lilith. Keane stepped back instinctively. The air shifted. The lantern dimmed. He felt watched again. But this time it was different. Not distant. Not from behind the walls. From beneath him. He turned to leave, gripping the book tightly. As he ascended, he thought he heard a whisper rise from the chamber, not from a mouth but from the very stones. A low murmur like a prayer that reversed itself, syllables that clawed at his understanding. Back in the main house, Keane sealed the passage, pushing the bookshelf into place with shaking hands. He set the book on the desk and began copying the symbols into his journal. His academic instincts were at war with his nerves. He had come here to study a haunting, to explore the legend of a cursed estate. But this was no legend. Someone, or something, had left instructions behind, rituals, names, and now the house was beginning to respond. He stared at the final symbol he'd drawn, the circle with Lilith at the center, and felt something cold trickle down his spine. The same name had been scribbled in the margins of the séance transcripts. It had appeared again and again in different handwriting, different ink, over different years. This wasn't just history, it was continuation. And he had found the altar. By the morning of the fourth day, the estate felt colder, heavier. The shadows seemed to follow Keen rather than retreat from him. Every sound lingered just a little too long. Still, he was not ready to concede to fear. He needed answers, ones that couldn't be found in crumbling books or blood-stained stone. The people of Drowsbury had lived under the shadow of this house for decades. Someone had to know more. He returned to the village under a grey sky, eyes alert for any flicker of recognition. As before, few dared meet his gaze. Most crossed the street or pulled their curtains tighter, but in front of the general store he spotted an old man sitting alone on a bench, nursing a pipe. His face was creased by time and weather, and his eyes were the colour of ash. Keen approached cautiously. "Good morning." The man didn't respond. "I'm staying at the Tolland estate." At that, the pipe fell from his hand. "You shouldn't be here," the man muttered, his voice like cracked wood. "You should have turned back the moment you saw the gate." Keen sat beside him, heart pounding. "What happened there? What do you know?" The old man glanced around, then leaned in close. "You think you're the first? We all kept count. 7 owners in the last 20 years. Not one stayed past the 7th night. One slit his own throat in the dining room. Another walked into the lake, pockets full of stones. Some just disappeared. No body, no trace. Just gone." "Do you know why?" Keen asked. "Because it feeds on them," the man whispered. "On fear, on guilt, on what they won't speak of. The house. It peels you open." Keen felt a chill run through him. "What's in the basement?" The old man shook his head. "That's not the basement, that's older. Built before the house, before the town even. Elias didn't build the estate over land. He built it over a wound." Keen didn't speak. He could feel his pulse in his throat. "There was a girl once," the old man added. "A servant, or maybe a daughter. Depends who you ask. She screamed for 7 days. And then silence. That's when the crying started. That's when the house changed." "Her name?" Keen asked. The man stood abruptly, voice hardening. "Don't say her name." "Lilith?" Keen offered, testing the edge of the word. The old man's face twisted. "If you know that name, you're already too deep. You need to leave, now. Before she sees you." "Who is she?" "She's not who. She's what's left." Back at the estate, the world felt different, like he'd stepped into a place slightly out of phase with time. Even the birds avoided the trees near the house. Keen stood at the gate for a long moment, the man's words echoing in his mind. She's what's left. Inside, the air was stagnant, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. He sat at the desk, pulled out his journal and began recording everything. The villager's silence, the old man's warning, the stories of prior owners. He wasn't sure if he was writing for himself anymore. Maybe he was documenting what would become his last thoughts. Maybe someone would find them after the 7th night. He glanced at the book he had taken from the hidden room. Its pages seemed to shift each time he opened it, symbols rearranging, words crawling to new positions. He could no longer dismiss the possibility that something was reading him as much as he was reading it, and still the girl in white had not returned. But her absence was no comfort. It was a promise. The 3rd night began with unease already embedded deep within Keen's bones. He had returned from the village, not with clarity, but with dread. The man's warning echoed in his mind, louder now with every passing hour. The estate felt more alive, its very walls pulsing with a silent expectation. It no longer merely watched, it waited. Keen tried to distract himself with books, but the text swam before his eyes. Words twisted into shapes, lines vanished mid-sentence. His journal, once a place of control, now felt like a record of descent. By 11, the temperature had dropped sharply. No wind, no rain, just an unnatural chill that crept beneath his skin. He wandered the halls to shake the feeling, the lantern flickering in his grasp. The portraits lining the corridor seemed to shift slightly when he wasn't looking. One, in particular, a woman with her head turned slightly left, was now staring forward. He didn't remember her face being so pale. As he passed the mirror outside the upstairs drawing room, something caught his eye. He paused, turned and stared into the glass. It was his reflection, but not entirely. The man staring back at him looked like Keane, but older, thinner, eyes sunken. And just behind that reflection, standing in the hallway where no one was the girl in white. Her face was still obscured, hair falling like curtains across her features, but this time her lips moved. No sound came through. Keane leaned in. The glass fogged slightly, as though someone breathed on the other side. Her lips moved again. A single word, slow, deliberate. Help. The lantern flickered violently, then steadied. Keane spun around. The hallway behind him was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, the girl was gone, but his own face remained pale, drawn tight with fear. He touched the glass. It was ice cold. He stumbled away, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. There was no mistaking it now. He was being drawn into something deeper than haunting, something personal. The house wasn't just showing him ghosts, it was showing him itself, and asking him to listen. Back in the study, he sat at the desk, face pale, hands trembling. He wrote what he'd seen, the girl's word, her silence, the presence in the reflection. He flipped through the Latin book from the altar room, searching again for a name, a sign, a match. This time something new stood out, a drawing, rough, frantic, of a woman's face obscured by long hair standing at the threshold of a mirror. Underneath it, in smudged ink, "The glass is thin where she waits." He whispered the phrase aloud, barely aware. He rose, suddenly compelled, and returned to the mirror. The lantern dimmed again. He approached slowly, watching himself move. This time there was nothing beyond his reflection, but the surface shimmered slightly, like heat over stone. He raised a hand and placed his palm against the glass. It vibrated faintly beneath his touch like a heartbeat. His reflection did not move. Keane jerked his hand back, breath shuddering. He backed away, unable to look away. He had no words for what he felt, only the certainty that the house was showing him its cracks. He retreated to the bedroom, locked the door, and shoved the dresser in front of it. The night stretched on, sleepless and silent. He didn't try to rest. He watched the mirror from across the room, waiting for something, anything, to reappear. And still the word echoed in his mind. Help. Was it a warning or an invitation? He didn't know which terrified him more. Keane awoke in the chair where he'd drifted off, the dim morning light barely reaching through the window. The mirror across the room was still intact, unbroken, undisturbed. But he didn't trust it. Not anymore. The word help clung to his memory like smoke. Who was she? Why reach out to him? He needed answers, concrete ones. Superstition had to give way to something tangible. The key, he reasoned, lay in the estate's past, and in the one man who had started it all, Elias Tolland. He returned to the study and began combing through every document he'd left untouched. Behind a stack of architectural sketches, he found a thin, leather-bound book without a title. Inside, delicate cursive dated it to 1857, Elias's handwriting. The entries were short, clipped, and increasingly erratic. The first few detailed daily events, garden maintenance, guest visits, financial matters. But by the middle, the tone shifted. She answered tonight. Through the table. The others heard her too. The candle flared when I spoke her name. I cannot unsee her eyes. She watched us all, even after the ritual ended. Keane felt the chill return as he turned the pages. The séances had begun as an experiment, an indulgence in the popular spiritualism of the age, but Elias had taken it further. He described building a channel, a door in the house's heart, through which a voice came clearer each night. And then a name appeared, Lilith. It was written over and over, growing larger with each entry, scribbled into margins, scrawled across blank pages. The last few entries were nearly unreadable, the ink smeared by what looked like water or tears. She demands witness. It was not meant for this world. I called her. The house is hers now. The door does not close. Keane closed the journal, pulse quickening. This was not folklore. This was confession. Elias had opened something, invited it in, and whatever it was, whatever Lilith was, had never left. Back in the hidden ritual room, he re-examined the altar. The same symbols from Elias's book were etched around its edges. The same script, the same circles, the same invocation lines. He was no longer dealing with vague hauntings or psychological strain. This was methodical, purposeful. He noticed something new in the corner of the room, a bundle of rotting cloth beneath a collapsed shelf. When he pulled it free, he found another notebook, damp, mold-eaten but intact. It belonged to one of Elias's guests, a medium named Colleen Meyer. Her tone was terrified from the beginning. He said she spoke, but I only heard screaming. The room grew cold. I felt her hand, not in mine, inside it. He wouldn't stop. He said she was truth. Colleen's final entry read, "I saw my death in her mouth." Keane clutched the journal to his chest, staring into the dim stone around him. This was no longer about academic curiosity or inherited property. This was legacy, of terror, of obsession, of an entity with a will. Lilith. Who or what was she? A spirit? A construct? A demon? Or something far older, older than the house, older than language? He returned to the surface in silence, sealing the secret room again. At his desk, he laid out both journals and began cross-referencing passages, tracing the rituals Elias had used. But each time the name Lilith appeared, he found himself unable to read the line aloud. His throat tightened. The ink seemed to ripple. The name had power even now. He wrote a final note in his own journal before nightfall. She is real. She was brought here by choice, and she has not finished. Outside, the fog thickened again. Inside, something shifted. The fourth night came on like a storm. Even though the sky outside remained clear, inside the Tolland estate, however, something was stirring. The silence that had once pressed on Keane's ears now transformed into a tangible presence. Shadows lengthened and twisted, crawling along walls and floors, as if alive. Keane sat in the study, lantern casting weak circles of light around the room. The air was thick and cold, the warmth of the fire all but extinguished. His fingers trembled as he wrote in his journal, documenting every detail of his unraveling mind and the strange phenomena he could no longer ignore. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. Shadows peeled away from the walls, slinking across the floor like dark smoke. They gathered near the door, pooling into an almost human shape, twisting, morphing as if trying to form a face, a hand, a figure. But it was never quite complete, always shifting, never solid. Keane rose slowly, heart pounding, and took a step back. The shadows recoiled, retreating like smoke driven by wind. Then, just as suddenly, they surged forward again, pressing toward him, crawling up the legs of the chair, clinging to his clothes like cold fingers. He tried to scream, but only a strangled sound escaped. The room spun. The shadows whispered, no longer unintelligible murmurs, but guttural hisses that slithered into his ears. "Leave! Leave! Leave!" Keane stumbled to the door, fumbling with the handle. As his hand closed around it, a searing pain tore through his shoulder. He looked down to see deep scratches glowing red and bleeding. The marks formed symbols, arcane, unfamiliar, etched into his flesh. He cursed, wrenching free and collapsing against the wall. The shadows faded, leaving behind a ringing silence and a cold sweat. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his hand against the wounds, tasting copper on his tongue. In the dim light, Keane noticed something else. Marks similar to those on his shoulder appeared faintly across his chest, as if invisible to the eye until touched by the light. Panic surged. The estate was not only alive, it was marking him, branding him as one of its own. He staggered to the desk and rifled through his journals. The name Lilith stared back at him from every page, her presence undeniable and growing. The symbols matched the scratches on his skin. He was becoming part of the house's dark story, another victim caught in its cycle. The thought made his stomach churn. He considered leaving, running from the estate, from the curse, from the girl in white and the unseen forces clawing at his sanity. But something kept him rooted. The need to understand, to end this nightmare before it swallowed him whole. Keane's mind reeled back to Elias Tolland's words from the journal. It only takes one answer to believe. He wondered if he was that answer. The estate was testing him, trying to break him down to something raw and helpless. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the sky, but inside, the estate remained in shadow. Keen knew that the coming days would be his last, if he did not find a way to fight back. He splashed cold water on his face and looked at his reflection in a cracked mirror. The scratches were still there, vivid and burning, but his eyes, those eyes, held a new resolve. This was no longer a place of study. It was a battleground. That afternoon, Keen found himself drawn back to Elias's study, a room he had barely explored. The air was thicker here, heavier, as though it held secrets desperate to escape. He rifled through the drawers until a small sealed envelope caught his eye. It was yellowed with age, the wax seal cracked and brittle. On the front, in shaky handwriting, was scrawled, "To my future kin." With trembling fingers, Keen broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The words were faded but legible. "If you are reading this, then I have failed. The house has claimed me, as it has so many before. You must know the truth of what lurks beneath the walls of the estate. It is not simply a haunting. It is a darkness older than our understanding, a force that feeds on the living and twists their souls. I, Elias Tolland, in my arrogance and desperation, sought to harness this power. I believed I could control it, bind it through ritual and blood. But I was wrong. I opened a door, an abyss, and invited what should never have been called. Her name is Lilith. She is not human, not spirit, but a demoness of vengeance and despair. She dwells beneath the house, in a place older than the foundations, and waits for the living to weaken and fall. The only way to end this is through sacrifice, a blood ritual that must be performed by one willing to bind themselves to the estate and seal the portal once more. But be warned, the cost is high, and few have survived to tell the tale. If you choose to stay, prepare yourself for the battle ahead, and remember, no owner has ever lasted beyond the 7th night. You are the 7th. Keen reread the letter twice, the words sinking like stones in his gut. The letter confirmed what he had long feared. The estate was more than a place. It was a trap, a cursed ground that devoured those who sought to claim it. His mind raced. The blood ritual, the sacrifice. Could he find a way to end this nightmare? Or was he destined to join the long list of owners lost to the estate's hunger? He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Outside, the sky had darkened once more, the sun swallowed by low-hanging clouds. The house seemed to close in around him, the walls pulsing with silent malice. Later that evening, as he sat in the dim light of the study, Keen's eyes caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of the room. A shadow flickered and shifted, unnaturally fast. His heart quickened. He thought of the scratched symbols on his chest, the marks that had appeared overnight, burning and raw. They were no longer fading, they were intensifying. The estate was marking him, claiming him. He reached for the journals and began cross-referencing the symbols with those in Elias's records. Each symbol had meaning, ancient, dark, connected to binding and control. They spoke of walls between worlds, of doors to realms best left unopened. But there was a way to reverse the curse. The ritual demanded blood, willing blood spilled at the altar deep beneath the house. Only then could the portal close. Yet Keen hesitated. The cost was unimaginable. Could he do it alone? Was he prepared to sacrifice himself to end this nightmare? The weight of the choice pressed down on him. He glanced at the clock. The grandfather clock remained stubbornly frozen at 3 a.m., the hour when everything had changed. Keen stood, resolved. He had no choice but to prepare. The 7th night was approaching fast, and with it, the reckoning. The 5th night arrived like a storm of silence, heavy and suffocating. The estate felt less like a house and more like a living nightmare, pressing in on Keen from every side. Sleep had become a distant memory, replaced by fitful rest and haunted dreams that clung to his mind. That night, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Keen was overwhelmed by visions, ghostly apparitions of those who had vanished before him. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, mouths moving without sound. They gathered in the dim hallways, reaching out with trembling hands, whispering the same chilling word. 7. The number echoed like a curse, a countdown he could not escape. Amid the phantoms, the girl in white appeared once more, her presence less ethereal, more real. She beckoned him, guiding him down the main staircase and through a hidden door that Keen had not noticed before. The air grew colder with each step. She led him to the estate's original altar, concealed deep in the woods beyond the garden, an ancient stone structure covered in moss and carved with the same symbols Keen had seen in the hidden chamber. The ground beneath was bare earth, disturbed as if recently used. The girl turned to him, her eyes now visible, deep pools of sorrow and warning. She whispered, a voice barely audible but clear in his mind. Only one sacrifice can end the cycle. Keen's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of her words settled on him like a shroud. The estate's curse demanded a blood price. The victims, the vanished, had all failed this test. He might be the last chance to break it, but at what cost? He stumbled back inside, the cold still clinging to his skin. He tried to dismiss the vision as a fevered dream, a trick of exhaustion, but the altar lingered in his mind like a beacon, a terrible promise. In his journal, he wrote every detail, his hand shaking as he tried to capture the urgency and fear that gripped him. He read through the letters from Elias and the medium Colleen once more. The sacrifice was not only physical but spiritual, a binding of will and blood. The house waited for him to choose. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying with it the voices of the lost. 7 nights, 7 souls consumed. Keen knew the countdown had entered its final phase. The 6th day dawned heavy with anticipation and dread. Keen sat at his desk, the faded journals and ritual texts spread before him like a map to an unknown abyss. Each symbol, each phrase, seemed to pulse with dark energy, calling him deeper into the estate's secrets. He pored over the translated passages, piecing together the ancient instructions Elias had left behind. The ritual required precise elements, a consecrated circle, a blood sacrifice, and a binding incantation. Every detail mattered. A single mistake could doom him, but the biggest obstacle was the sacrifice itself. The texts were clear. The blood had to be willingly given. Forced offerings would fail. Only one who truly accepted the burden could seal the portal and end Lilith's reign. The choice weighed heavily on Keen. Could he offer his own life, or was there another way? His thoughts drifted to the girl in white, the silent plea for help that echoed in the mirror. Was she a victim, like those before him? Could he save her soul as well as his own? Keen rose and began gathering the necessary items. Candles of pure wax, salt, the rusted dagger he'd found in the hidden room, and the journals that contained the incantations. Each step brought a mixture of hope and despair. He was preparing for a confrontation he could barely comprehend. The house responded immediately. Doors slammed shut, windows rattled, shadows thickened in the corners, whispering threats and promises alike. Keen pressed on, chanting the words he had practiced quietly, trying to steady his voice against the growing terror. He set the ritual circle in the old parlor, tracing the symbols carefully with salt, his hands steady, despite the cold sweat that soaked his palms. He lit the candles, their flames dancing wildly as if resisting the darkness. As night fell, Keen stood within the circle, ready for what was to come. The air grew thick, the temperature plummeted. He felt a presence press against the edges of his vision, something watching, waiting, hungry. In the deepest part of his mind, he heard Lilith's voice, a hiss that curled like smoke, promising pain, eternal torment, and the inevitability of surrender. But Keen's resolve did not waver. He raised the dagger, the cold steel a stark contrast to the heat of his fear. His breath caught as he made the first incision on his palm, crimson spilling into the circle. The symbols flared with an eerie glow, illuminating the room in ghostly light. Pain and power surged together, coursing through him like fire and ice. The house trembled, as if fighting to keep its secret alive. Keen closed his eyes and began the incantation, his voice firm despite the shaking in his chest. The words echoed through the estate, rattling windows and stirring the shadows into violent motion. Time seemed to stretch. The air thickened. Then a shriek pierced the silence, a sound so raw and primal it shook Keen to his core. Lilith had answered. The sixth night descended with a fury unlike any before. The estate seemed to roar, as if alive and enraged. Keen's body trembled with every breath, his soul stretched to the edge of endurance. The ritual had begun, but the house was not willing to surrender its prisoner without a fight. Lightning cracked outside, casting brief, violent shadows across the walls. Windows rattled with the force of the storm. Keen's voice rose in desperate chants, his words weaving a fragile barrier against the darkness that pressed ever closer. But Lilith was relentless. Her presence swelled like a suffocating tide, invading every corner of the house, creeping beneath the floorboards and swirling in the cold draughts. The air was thick with screams, echoes of pain and fury from those who had come before. At one point, Keen felt a searing coldness seize his limbs, as if invisible hands gripped him tight, trying to drag him into the shadows. His vision blurred, heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal. In the deepest recesses of his mind, he fought a battle beyond comprehension. Flashbacks tore through his consciousness, visions of past owners, their terror, their screams, their failures. Lilith's voice twisted these memories into chains, threatening to bind him forever. His voice faltered, but he forced himself to continue the incantation, the words trembling on his lips but never breaking. Suddenly the room erupted in chaos. Furniture overturned, candles snuffed out in a gust of supernatural wind. The shadows solidified into a dark form, a monstrous silhouette, eyes blazing with hatred and hunger. Lilith revealed herself, a terrifying visage of wrath and sorrow intertwined. Her voice was a hiss, sharp and cutting, echoing through the chamber. "You cannot deny me, Jonathan." Keen's heart surged with defiance. "I do not fear you," the demoness laughed, a sound that shattered glass and hearts alike. She lunged forward, a rush of cold that threatened to freeze his very soul. Keen stumbled back into the salt circle, the protective barrier flaring with spectral light. Pain seared through his chest as the marks burned brighter, the symbols glowing with an otherworldly fire. He gritted his teeth, grounding himself in the words of the ritual. His mind screamed to hold on, to resist the darkness that sought to consume him whole. The battle stretched on, time losing meaning as light clashed with shadow. Every moment was a struggle to retain his sanity, his will, and his life. And then, as the first rays of dawn threatened the horizon, Lilith screamed, a piercing wail that echoed through the house, fading into silence. The shadows dissolved. The air cleared. The house exhaled. Keen collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. Morning came quietly, like a fragile truce. The house, for the first time in days, stood still, no whispers in the walls. No shadows shifting beyond reach. The silence was not empty. It was listening, watching, waiting. Keen lay on the cold floor of the parlor, his limbs numb, his body trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. The symbols surrounding him had faded, scorched into the wood. The dagger, stained and resting near his outstretched hand, glinted in the new light. He forced himself to sit up. Every muscle ached, his chest burned with the echo of the ritual, yet he was alive. The sacrifice had been made. He rose slowly and stepped out into the hallway. The house was unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in feeling. It was no longer pressing against him, no longer pushing him toward madness. The walls no longer whispered his name, but something else had changed. As he moved room to room, he noticed small signs of peace. The mirror in the drawing room no longer rippled. The girl in white did not appear. The attic door, once sealed by chains, stood open. Keen ascended the stairs, unsure why, drawn by an instinct deeper than thought. The attic was empty save for dust, light streaming through a circular window he hadn't seen before. On the floor lay a single object, the necklace the girl had worn in every vision, a silver chain with a cracked porcelain locket. He picked it up and opened it. Inside was a faded photo of Elias Tolland and a young girl, no older than 12. She had a name, a face, a history. She was no longer just an echo in the dark. She had been someone. Keane closed the locket and held it tightly. He returned to the hidden altar beneath the estate, the stone floor now cool and inert. The name carved at the center, Lilith, had faded, as though scorched out by the ritual's fire. The energy was gone, the air still. He whispered a quiet apology, unsure if it was for the girl, for Elias, or for the thing that had nearly claimed him. Then he left the chamber and sealed it behind him forever. By late afternoon, he stood outside the estate, the iron gate yawning before him. His bag was packed with little more than the journals and the locket. The sky above was clear, the wind soft. Even the trees surrounding the estate seemed to breathe easier. He turned back once, looking at the house that had nearly broken him. The Tolland estate was silent, but not malevolent. Not anymore.